Waffen SS who joined the Foreign Legion. In the aftermath of the Second World War, France was in shambles, having been occupied by the Germans for most of the war. Even though the fighting in Europe was over, France's overseas colony of Indochina was in revolt, and the ravaged nation desperately needed soldiers to stamp out the rebellion. Exhausted after years of war and occupation, they were forced to tap into a new pool of manpower, which came from an unlikely source. The SS, or Schutzstaffel, has its origins in the 1920s as Hitler's bodyguard and security for the Nazi Party. The organization grew in size and was split into separate branches, one of which was the Waffen SS, which amounted to the armed wing of the Nazi Party, becoming a paramilitary organization which fought alongside the Wehrmacht. During the conflict, they committed countless atrocities as part of the Nazis' racial agenda, especially on the Eastern Front. After the war, members of the Waffen SS became wanted criminals, and many fled abroad to avoid punishment for their actions. These fugitives were in need of a way to put aside their past lives and begin anew, and an opportunity presented itself, which would be mutually beneficial to both the fugitive SS and the desperate French. Since the 1800s, France has maintained a Foreign Legion, a military unit that was composed of non-French nationals, though French citizens can join if they wish. One of the hallmarks of the Legion is its openness to taking on recruits with debatable backgrounds. Historically, the ranks have been filled with criminals, vagabonds, and other outcasts from society that are looking for a fresh start. Today, standards are somewhat more strict, with criminals wanted by Interpol as well as hardened criminals such as murderers and drug traffickers not being accepted, though they will turn a blind eye to other lesser crimes. In fact, having a petty criminal record is highly favored, since the recruit is more likely to want to leave his past life behind, making them more devoted to the Legion. The only other restrictions are the age, mental capacity, and physical fitness of the recruits. Any man between 17 and 40 years old, in good mental and physical health, from anywhere in the world, regardless of ethnicity, religion, political affiliation, status, or wealth, education level, or any other factor, can and have been accepted. No further questions asked. Those looking to start afresh get the opportunity to do so by serving in the Legion. In fact, anonymity is a requirement, with new recruits being forced to enlist under an assumed name called an anonyma, only being allowed to use their real names if they so choose after a certain length of service. This system is perfect for those who want to leave behind past transgressions or avoid prosecution for their crimes. Germans have always had a major presence in the French Foreign Legion. Just before the outbreak of World War II, it was estimated that around 80% of the Legion's NCOs were of German origin. After the war, conditions were right for a large influx of German recruits. The nation was occupied by hostile powers, and many former soldiers fled potential retribution by joining up with their former adversaries, taking advantage of required anonymity. In fact, so many enlisted that according to a New York article from May 1947, up to 80% of a 5,000-man unit sent to French Indochina were Germans, mostly recruited from POWs. These men were described as being in their mid-20s and whose only profession was war, making them, in the words of the article, true mercenaries. For members of the Waffen SS, this was a way for them to avoid being placed on trial for their crimes. Even with the Legion's policy of anonymity, however, there are limits to what they'll turn a blind eye to. Due to the atrocities they committed, the SS members would not admit to their previous association with the organization, but portrayed themselves simply as normal German soldiers, hoping to slip by the screening process. There was one major complication with this. Members of the Waffen SS were often tattooed with their blood type, which was printed with small letters on the underside of the left arm near the armpit. This was done to ensure the proper blood type was given for a transfusion, should the dog tags go missing. After the war, having a tattoo in this area was often seen as proof that the man was a member of the SS and treated accordingly by the Allied forces. This wasn't a perfect system, as not all SS members were tattooed, and many regular German Wehrmacht soldiers did have a blood group tattoo, especially those who had been treated at SS hospitals. To avoid detection, SS members would painfully remove the tattoo, destroying the evidence of their past associations. Still, wary French Foreign Legion recruitment teams were on the lookout for candidates who had the blood tattoo, or those who had suspicious scars where a tattoo would normally be found. In spite of this, many Waffen SS members managed to slip by the screening process and join the Legion, evading detection, particularly in the years right after the war, though eventually the French authorities would crack down on the recruitment process with more efficiency as time went on. After induction into the Foreign Legion, the Legionnaires would be sent to Indochina, what would later be called Vietnam, to quell the ever-growing insurgency there. The Legion's troops were a badly needed source of French manpower in an increasingly difficult situation. The Legion would play a pivotal role in the conflict, including the disastrous final siege at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, when the Viet Minh communist fighters overran the French garrison. So, does the claim that large numbers of SS members joining the Foreign Legion hold any weight? It's hard to say, but more than likely, no. Determining how many of the Legionnaires were former members of the SS is at best a daunting task. There is no doubt that large numbers of Germans ended up in Southeast Asia, with some estimates placing the total number between 35,000 and 50,000 during the 8-year-long French military operation against the Viet Minh. The challenge is determining whether these men were SS members on the run, former members of the Wehrmacht who were looking for a fresh start, or simply young German men who saw service in the French Foreign Legion as a better alternative to living in post-war Germany. Over the years, claims about the number of war criminals in the Foreign Legion's ranks have swelled in scope, with many believing that there were thousands of SS members serving. There are two main sources for this belief, one being a book, The Devil's Guard, published in 1971, which details the life of an SS officer who fought on the Eastern Front, then joined the Foreign Legion. It describes an entire battalion of former Nazi soldiers conducting a guerrilla campaign against the Viet Minh. The work presents itself as an authentic memoir, but the historical validity can generously be described as lacking, with little actual evidence to support the claims made, and today it's considered a work of fiction. Compounding this were the Viet Minh themselves, who, after capturing thousands of French troops at Dien Bien Phu, claimed that there were large numbers of Waffen SS in their ranks. They never produced any evidence to back up these claims, and it is possible that they considered all Germans to be fleeing war criminals, or at least described them as such. Regardless of reasoning, there is little, if any, evidence to support the claim that thousands of SS members had joined the Foreign Legion and fought in Indochina. To summarize, it's known that after the war, a large influx of German recruits flooded into the Legion. However, the French authorities were specifically on the lookout for SS members who would be rejected and apprehended. The Legion's policy on anonymity meant that should the fugitives somehow pass the initial screening, their identity and former allegiances would be next to impossible to track with any accuracy. Add to this the unreliable reports by the Viet Minh and the later sensationalized accounts claiming to be factual information, there is nothing but muddy water on an already unclear subject. Claims of thousands of SS members who joined the Legion to avoid prosecution for their crimes is most likely highly exaggerated, and while no doubt a few did escape justice in this manner, the number is likely very small, though the truth has been lost to history. Japanese soldiers fighting on after World War II. In 1945, the Second World War was finally drawing to a close. Hitler's last stand had taken place in his bunker on April 30th, when he and his wife Eva Braun had committed suicide after it became apparent that there was no way out, and the German Third Reich formally surrendered on May 7, 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had each an atomic bomb dropped on them, forcing the formal Japanese surrender on August 15th, announced by Emperor Hirohito, and 2 weeks later on September 2nd, the war was officially over. Despite hostilities finally coming to an end, it seems that not everyone got the message. Some Japanese soldiers held out into the 1950s, 60s, and 70s for a mixture of reasons. Some had been sent to remote Pacific islands, and communication had simply been lost with the outside world, and so they missed the broadcasts that the war had ended. Others doubted the legitimacy of Japan's surrender, and others still just simply refused to believe it was all over. Japanese soldiers were trained in using the Bushido code fighting ethic. They were taught that every fight was to the death, and that it was an honor to die for the emperor. But to surrender was both shameful and dishonorable. Because of this belief, they could not accept that their leaders would have given in and surrendered. That's why only a small percentage of Japanese soldiers surrendered during the war, whilst the majority were either captured, wounded, or killed. And why, decades later, there were still some Japanese holdouts fighting a war that no longer existed. Two of the first holdouts discovered in the 1950s were Private First Class Yuichi Akatsu and Corporal Shoichi Shimada, who had remained on Lubang Island in the Philippines, with a group led by Second Lieutenant Hiro Onoda, with orders to slow down the enemy forces by any means possible. By the time the Allies took the island on February 28, 1945, only Onoda and 3 other men remained alive, and so they retreated, hiding deep in the jungle and waging guerrilla tactics on the locals for supplies. After the end of the war and over the next 5 years, the Allies repeatedly dropped pamphlets in the jungle for the holdouts to find, detailing the end of the war. The men examined the pamphlets and deemed them fake. But in 1949, Yuichi Akatsu walked away from the other 3 men. He continued to live alone for another 6 months before surrendering to the village of Lok in March 1950. 2 years later, in 1952, the Allies dropped another series of letters and family photos across the jungle. But the 3 remaining men ignored them, still convinced it was a trick. A year later, Private Shimada was shot in the leg during a guerrilla raid. Despite Onoda successfully nursing him back to health, Shimada died in 1954, this time shot by a search party that had gone into the jungle looking for the 3 men. The other 2 soldiers continued to hide out in the jungle until the 1970s. But there were more holdouts elsewhere. In June 1944, over a year before the war ended, 3 Japanese transport ships were bombed by the Americans. About 30 survivors of the wreckage managed to swim to safety to the nearby island of Anatahan, which was part of the Mariana chain of islands off the coast of the Philippines. Later in 1944, the U.S. successfully invaded the Mariana Islands, ignoring the smaller parts of the archipelago like Anatahan, seizing the main islands in the chain. They had no idea of the Japanese residing there until the natives on nearby islands informed them. Anatahan was a small volcanic island and had very few native residents. The 30 Japanese who reached it struggled to survive, eating a diet of coconuts, insects, bats, and lizards to get by. Their conditions improved slightly after an American B-29 Superfortress bomber experienced difficulty and crashed on the island, providing the castaways with vital resources and tools so that they were able to build shelters. After Japan had surrendered, the Americans attempted to evacuate Mariana, taking 45 residents and 2 Japanese from Anatahan. But the 30 shipwreck victims refused to believe the war was over, fleeing further inland where they continued to live for another 6 years as holdouts. Among the Japanese already living and working on the island were a married couple, Shoichi and Kazuko Higa. Shoichi had left the island before all this happened to visit his sick sister on another island, but was unable to return. With 1 woman and 30 men on an island, you can probably imagine the kind of tension that arose. Kazuko pretended to be married to another Japanese plantation worker with the same surname of Higa for her own protection. But her new husband didn't last too long after he mysteriously drowned, and then the men turned on each other for a chance for her affections. Over the next 6 years, they foraged and fought for survival and spent a lot of their time drunk, having discovered a way to ferment a drink known as tuba or coconut wine, leading to violent fights and jealous rivalries that resulted in 12 of the original 30 dying on the island. As the only woman, Higa had to be smart to protect herself against the drunk and aggressive men she found herself stranded with. So she often stuck close to 4 of the men in particular, sparking jealousy in the rest as she hid behind them to fend off unwanted advances. Finally, in 1950, Higa saw a U.S. vessel off the coast and raced to flag it down, asking to be taken off the island, therefore ending her nightmare as a holdout. Through her, the US and Japanese authorities learnt of the forgotten men on the island, who still did not believe that Japan had surrendered. The authorities asked their families to write letters as proof that the war was truly over. They were dropped on Anatahan in 1951, along with an official message from the governor of Kanagawa Prefecture. The holdouts were finally convinced. Waving white flags on the beach in surrender, they waited for US officials to collect them from the island and send them back home. Their story became a huge sensation in Japan, and Kasuko Higa became an actress but was forever painted as the temptress seductress of Anatahan Island and was eventually forced to go into hiding. Meanwhile, on another Mariana Island, Tinian, another Japanese holdout remained, Murata Susumu. In 1944, one of the larger Pacific Island battles of World War II took place, the Battle of Tinian. The fighting went on for 9 days before the US ultimately declared victory, and a few hundred remaining Japanese soldiers fled deep into Tinian's jungles to avoid capture and surrender. These soldiers were slowly weeded out over the coming months, with the final garrison surrendering on August 4, 1945, after the war was over. But one man remained, Murata Susumu. He had set up a shack on Tinian's coast and continued to live in isolation there for the next 8 years, before he was finally captured in 1953. 2 years later, another Japanese holdout was discovered on the Philippines' largest island, Luzon. Seaman Noboru Kinoshita was one of many forgotten Japanese servicemen hiding themselves away in the island's jungles. He had fled there in 1944 after surviving the sinking of a troop ship, and then spent the next 11 years living off lizards, frogs, fruits, and wild monkeys in the jungle, unaware that the war was over. He was finally discovered in November 1955 when he was picked up by Philippines police during his raid on a jungle-side sweet potato patch, and he expected to be executed for theft. Upon finding out his enemy planned to send him back to Japan a free man instead, he hanged himself rather than face the shame of returning home. That same year, in 1955 in Dutch New Guinea, 4 Japanese airmen surrendered a whole decade after the end of the war. The Japanese had invaded Dutch New Guinea in 1942, afterwards leaving behind troops to maintain control of the island. The 4 airmen were part of a larger battalion who marched from Wewak to Hollandia in 1944. 89 men set out on the forced march, but 30 of them drowned trying to cross a storm-swollen river, and others died from hunger and disease. When the remaining men discovered the Allies had taken Hollandia, they decided to hide in the jungle until Japanese forces recaptured the land. Later, they were discovered and attacked. 5 fled deeper into the jungle, crossing the border into Dutch New Guinea and becoming self-sufficient off the land there. Due to their poor diets and lack of resources, one of the 5 died of malaria in 1947. The other 4 continued to live on in the jungle for another 8 years before being discovered by a villager from a nearby settlement. Despite learning that the war was over and that the US and Japan were now friends, the airmen refused to believe it, but stayed in touch with the villagers nonetheless. It was 3 years later that the locals and police finally convinced the airmen that the war was over, and they, at long last, surrendered themselves. In 1956, 13 more Japanese soldiers were discovered on the islands of Morotai and Mindoro. Both islands had experienced Pacific battles during the war, and many Japanese had fled into the jungles to hide. The Allies had no interest in wasting resources on these stragglers, and so some lived there for years after the war, unseen and forgotten about. On Morotai, 9 soldiers were found in 1956, and on Mindoro, 4 men surrendered in November of the same year. The Morotai and Mindoro holdouts marked the end of those discovered in the 1950s, but over subsequent decades, many more Japanese were discovered, with the final 2 holdouts surrendering in 1974, almost 30 years after the end of the war.
The German POWs forced to walk in a minefield after World War II. Denmark, 1945 to 1946. On the first days of May 1945, after 6 years of bloody fighting, peace finally came to Europe with the surrender of Nazi Germany. But with the end of World War II, new problems emerged, like what to do about the tens of millions of land and sea mines left over from the conflict. On May 4, 1945, the German forces that were in Denmark surrendered themselves to the Allies and started their arrangements to leave. Denmark had around 1.4 million active landmines in its territory that had been laid by the Germans along its western coastline during the years that they had occupied the country from 1940 to 1945. These mines were mainly on beaches and also around a few key facilities such as radar stations. Part of the act of surrender signed by the Germans stipulated that they should follow the Allies' orders on any matter without argument. The British military, who were in charge of the area after liberating Denmark right at the end of the war, ordered the creation of a group to clear the German landmines. It was already in operation by May 11, 1945. The Minekommando Danmark, as it was called, was formed from German prisoners of war who were officially categorized as surrendered enemy personnel. The insistence on the Germans clearing the mines was because they knew how to handle those mines. They had information on where they were planted. The Danish authorities felt that this was in clear violation of the Geneva Convention, but didn't intervene or object at that time, probably because most of the landmines were on much-needed farmland and there was a growing food shortage in Europe. The alternative would have been that inexperienced Danish and British personnel would carry out the task. But there was also the thought that Germany was responsible for laying the mines, so it should be the Germans to clear them up. So between 750 and 2,000 German prisoners of war, with many teenagers among them, were forced to help clear away these mines. These soldiers were pioneer troops, so they had some knowledge in engineering. They were given some basic training in mine clearance, as well as having support by British Army sappers. These sappers were combat engineers who were experts in defusing mines. The reason this may well have broken the Geneva Convention, which governed on how civilians and soldiers should be humanely treated during wartime, was that the Allies were making the POWs carry out dangerous work against their will. The task was made very hazardous, as the Germans had not only laid so many mines, but they had used so many different types of mines throughout the war that made the task of clearing them so much more complicated. In fact, there had been 16 types of anti-tank mines and 10 types of anti-personnel mines commonly used by the Germans during the war. These included anti-tank teller mines, Holtz mines, and anti-personnel mines such as S-mines, stock mines, and shoe mines. Many of these mines were booby-trapped or were hard to detect as they were made mostly of wood and glass, with the only metal used in the detonators. To complicate the matter further, the mines laid early on in the war and their locations were meticulously recorded by German engineers, but later on, the mines were hastily laid by inexperienced, hurried units. They didn't take the time to precisely map where they had laid individual mines or at times where exactly entire minefields were. The German POWs used a number of methods to remove the mines, which would be seen as highly dangerous today. They would prod the ground with a pointed stick or bayonet at an angle to avoid triggering the mechanism on top. This meant that the deminer's head and hands were right up close to the mine. As well as this, no protective equipment was worn, and the demining was done in groups with no safe distance between them. Where there were metallic anti-tank type mines, British No. 3 mine detectors could be used, but for other types of mines, only a long prodder worked. Once the minefield was declared clear, the German deminers formed a line and marched through it. This was the way to prove that the area was now clear and there were no forgotten mines. Sometimes the local population was invited to watch as reassurance that their local area was clear of danger. In just a few months, 1,389,281 mines had been cleared. It's estimated that as many as 20% of German POWs clearing these mines in Denmark at the end of the war were either killed or badly wounded during this 2-year-long operation. Though later, clearing these minefields was made that much easier, as it was discovered that some of the mines were painted with a semi-radioactive paint. This was a strategy used by the Germans, so they were the only ones who could find them. This meant they could easily and safely be located by a Geiger counter, but not with a metal detector. Using German prisoners at the end of the war to clear minefields wasn't uncommon. This happened in Norway too, where the German prisoners were not classed as POWs, but as disarmed forces who had surrendered unconditionally. This allowed them to be used for hazardous duties without being accused of breaking the Geneva Convention. At the time, there was little concern or outcry about this by politicians or the press, with the strong anger towards Germany during the war. But in recent times, there has been growing controversy over this chapter of Danish history, as some claim what happened to these German POWs amounted to a war crime. Most of the surviving German POWs involved were returned to their homeland 2 years later, though it wasn't until 2012 that the Danish coastline was officially declared free of mines left over from World War II. The Werewolf holdouts, last-ditch Nazi resistance, World War II. In 1944, there was a widespread realization among the Nazi leadership that they could actually lose the war. Then on June 6th of that year, their worst fears came true when the Allies successfully landed a massive invasion force at Normandy in northern France and threatened to retake occupied Europe. The Nazi leadership quickly started to fall apart after that point, and there was even a serious attempt on July 20th, 1944 to assassinate Hitler with a bomb at his Wolf Lair headquarters in East Prussia. Hitler and his senior officials were looking for a last resort to keep Nazi ideology alive and turned to the supernatural for inspiration. The Germans proceeded to put a contingency plan into place, codenamed Operation Werewolf. The idea was to create a covert resistance force to continue the Nazi struggle as the Allies advanced through Germany. The strategy was not so much to win the war by guerrilla fighting, but to hold out long enough for a political settlement more favorable to Germany. Werewolves and wolves were used as symbols of German strength against those seeking to destroy them. The movement was designed to be decentralized and was mainly overseen by regional security officials. This was partly a reaction to the military bombardment under which Germany found itself. Decentralization would allow groups to operate independently should any part of the network fail. Towards the end of that year, Heinrich Himmler, who was head of the feared Waffen SS, had recruited one of his most senior officers, a Nazi fanatic called Hans Adolf Preutzmann, to set up, train, and coordinate the new werewolf units. These elite groups of volunteers were to be trained in guerrilla warfare tactics, sniping, sabotage, assassination, and fashioning improvised explosives. They were ordered to sabotage, commit acts of terrorism, suppress German collaboration, and generally make life as difficult as possible for the occupying Allies. They were supposed to be provided with the latest specialized equipment like suppressed pistols, fireproof coats, and high-tech sniper rifles to carry out these missions. But the werewolf units never saw their full realization, as Nazi Germany fell into total disarray from the constant Allied aerial bombing. This had caused severe equipment shortages, as Germany's industrial base was almost completely destroyed. By the end of 1944, Preutzmann had only gathered about 5,000 fighters. Nevertheless, by early 1945, several hundred recruits had been trained at the Werewolf's chief training camp at the medieval Hulkrath Castle near Erkelenz in Germany. Most of these recruits were drawn from the Hitler Youth. One of the few wartime missions carried out by members of the Werewolf organization was Operation Carnival on March 20, 1945. During this mission, a werewolf unit parachuted into a Belgian forest on the Dutch-Belgian border outside of the German city of Aachen, using a captured Luftwaffe-operated U.S. Army B-17 Flying Fortress bomber. Their target for assassination was the Allied-appointed mayor of Aachen, Franz Oppenhoff, who the Nazis considered to be a traitor. They used intelligence to discover Oppenhoff's whereabouts and successfully assassinated him on March 25, 1945. In fact, he was killed by an SS unit which was composed of werewolf trainees from Hulkrath Castle. One of the 6-person team was Isa Hirsch, who was a League of German Maidens girl and a captain. She was chosen because she would arouse less suspicion as Allied patrols were looking for military-aged men wandering around. The werewolf unit pretended to be German pilots who were looking for the front lines. As Oppenhoff persuaded them to surrender, they shouted "Heil Hitler!" and shot Oppenhoff in the head. One of the assassins was killed, and Hirsch was injured afterwards when they triggered a landmine while fleeing through a nearby forest. The landmine was likely placed by the German army. The rest of the werewolf unit escaped into the countryside. A small group of SS Werewolf staff were able to make their way into the Alps after the surrender, where they joined forces with a few soldiers and attempted to make a last stand. The makeshift unit was beset with problems, bad weather, breakdowns, and unsurprisingly, desertions, and was finally defeated by US forces. Much was made of the propaganda value of these so-called werewolf units, with German newspapers running sensational and mostly fictitious headlines such as "Fury of Nazi werewolves to be unleashed on invaders." Lieutenant Otto Skorzeny, a commando specialist and holder of the Knight's Cross, was later brought in to oversee training and further development of the werewolf units. Jürgen Stroop,
famous for crushing the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943, was also asked to consult. They were stunned to find out that the number of werewolf cells had been greatly exaggerated, and those few units in existence were highly disorganized. Even the secret supply dumps buried around the country were not properly recorded, so few of the units knew where any of them actually were. The explosives, ammunition, and weapons had been buried in 1939, but by 1945 no one knew their location, and the advancing Soviets discovered most of them. Skorzeny then turned the efforts of Operation Werewolf towards establishing a Nazi underground railroad, which allowed thousands of SS officers to travel along escape routes called rat lines and flee. On March 23, 1945, Joseph Goebbels, the Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, gave a speech known as the Werewolf Speech, in which he said it was every German's duty to fight to the death. Then on April 1st, Radio Werewolf started broadcasting from a small town in eastern Germany, and its message was simple: resist the Allied invaders by whatever means possible. It began each program with a howling wolf sound and a song with the words, "My werewolf teeth bite the enemy." The radio station was on the air for only a matter of weeks, but it enthusiastically claimed several high-ranking Allied officers had been successfully assassinated by werewolf units, including Major General Maurice Rose, commander of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, and British Major John Poston, liaison officer of Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. In fact, both of these deaths were actually due to being in combat against German regular army units. In early April 1945, Goebbels' top aide, a Nazi called Werner Naumann, sent out a long and rambling message to the heads of all major propaganda offices across Germany. He called on them to encourage the German people to prepare and continue fighting beyond the end of the war. All of this created the illusion of an organized and dedicated Nazi secret resistance, so much so that the Allies took the threat seriously. Operation Werewolf was highly effective in its psychological impact that it had on the Allies and on German civilians. Hitler had committed suicide by shooting himself on April 30th, 1945, in his Führerbunker in Berlin. But for a while, every act of sabotage, mysterious accident, or misfortune that befell the Allied occupiers in Germany after the war ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, was credited to the werewolves. For a long time, Allied commanders had been concerned that they would face a wide-scale German insurgency and were terrified they were going to become embroiled in a partisan war that could drag out for years. Rumors concerning Operation Werewolf played directly into this fear. Allied propaganda meant that for the first few months of the occupation, there was a strict policy of non-fraternization with German citizens. Resistors were often shot or hanged, and it was believed that any German showing their right ear in an ID card photo was a secret wolf. Even local groups who offered to assist in the hunt for Nazis were not above suspicion. Strict regulations were placed on the German population, curfews were established, and it was made illegal to own firearms. By some estimates, between 3,000 to 5,000 German civilians and soldiers lost their lives in Allied reprisals out of fear of werewolf units. This fear eventually subsided, as the werewolf threat seemed to simply fade away, as the danger of the Nazis continuing an armed struggle never really materialized. Ultimately, the werewolf's propaganda value ended up far outweighing its actual achievements. In fact, the damage done was mostly to the German citizenry, since historians estimate that several thousand deaths resulted from the werewolf campaigns, because they targeted all those who welcomed the Allies. A few other groups of werewolves were able to hold out until 1947, but for the most part they were limited to slogan painting and acts of sabotage. After the war, the Allies carried out a highly successful policy of denazification, which was designed to eradicate all the symbols, political organizations, and figureheads that had been created to support the Nazi culture from German society. Then the new rising danger was the Soviet Union and its allies. Rather than continue to fight against the occupying forces of Great Britain, the United States, and France, the German people were more concerned in dealing with this new impending threat. So soon, the West German countryside would be full of large packs of leopards with roaming lynxes flying overhead and cobras hiding in every hedgerow in an attempt to deter any attack by the Soviet Union.
Hiro Onoda, the Japanese soldier who didn't surrender until 1974. Hiro Onoda was a Japanese intelligence officer in the Imperial Japanese Army who refused to surrender until decades after World War II had ended. In the Pacific Theater, There were many Japanese holdouts holding Zanryu Nipponye, or remaining Japanese soldiers. They were motivated to continue on after the surrender of Japan in August 1945 because of their dogmatic, militaristic indoctrination or simply because they were unaware of the surrender. Hiro Onoda was trained at the Nakano School as an intelligence officer where he was taught guerrilla warfare and intelligence gathering. Onoda was sent to Lubang Island near Luzon in the Philippines in late 1944, where he would soon meet up with a group of other Japanese soldiers already on the island. Mijiyoshimi Taniguchi had given him orders to live off the land and forbade him to die by his own hand. He would further reassure Officer Onoda by saying, "It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead them." Higher-ranked officers in the group made Onoda unable to carry out his mission to sabotage the enemy airstrip and pier at the harbor. This in turn made the U.S. conquest of the island, which was achieved in February 1945, easy. Once U.S. forces were on the island, the large group split up into smaller groups of 3 to 4 men and escaped into the jungle and were either picked off by the U.S. troops or surrendered until it was just Hiro Onoda and 3 others under his command which were left active. Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, all of which had set up base in the mountains. After Japan had formally surrendered in September 1945, Onoda and his group came across a number of leaflets. The first leaflet, left behind by locals, was discovered quite soon, reading, "The war ended on August 15th, come down from the mountain." However, they concluded that it was an Allied propaganda trick. After this conclusion, the group continued to raid local islanders for food and other resources. General Tomoyuki Yamashita of the 14th Area Army also dropped leaflets from the air with a surrender order, but again the group decided that they were a trick. With a lack of knowledge of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it may have seemed more unlikely that Japan was willing to surrender. In 1949, Yuichi Akatsu escaped from the group and surrendered to Filipino forces in 1950, causing the remaining 3 to be cautious to disloyalty. In 1952, the search mission was expanded with letters and pictures from the group's families dropped from an aircraft, but again, this was wrote off as a trick by the 3 soldiers. Every piece of evidence the group came across increased their paranoia and hostilities. While they were dressed in their Imperial Japanese uniforms, the people they came across were in civilian clothing, which they interpreted as Allied soldiers in disguise, with the strategy of luring them out. As a result, they didn't think twice when firing on the locals. Corporal Shoichi Shimada was shot in the leg but recovered with the help of Onoda in 1953. But on May 7, 1954, he was killed by a search party when he fired upon his potential rescuers who returned fire on a beach at Gunton. Now just 2 remained. Onoda and Kozuka would continue the mission to sabotage, gather intelligence on, and attack the enemy, which no longer existed. But on October 19, 1972, during a skirmish, Kozuka was shot and killed by the police when he was burning a farmer's rice collection. Lieutenant Onoda was now alone. On February 20, 1974, a determined Japanese explorer called Norio Suzuki found Onoda. Onoda still refused to surrender. However, Suzuki had the idea to locate his original commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. In March 1974, his former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, traveled to the Philippines to fulfill his promise to return and end his orders in person. Onoda, still wearing his tattered army uniform from decades ago, saluted the Japanese flag and handed over his samurai sword, his functioning Arasaka Type 99 rifle, several rounds of ammunition, hand grenades, and his family dagger. The Philippine government under President Ferdinand Marcos granted him a pardon, taking into consideration that although he had killed 30 innocent people during his campaign on the island, he thought the war was still carrying on. When he returned to Japan, Onoda was very popular, but he found it hard to adjust to the new post-war Japan and the decay of its traditional values. He published an autobiography and in 1975 left Japan for Brazil, where he raised cattle and later opened a series of training schools. In his last years, Hiro Onoda said in an interview, "Every Japanese soldier was prepared for death, but as an intelligence officer, I was ordered to conduct guerrilla warfare and not to die. I became an officer and I received an order. If I could not carry it out,
I would feel shame. I am very competitive.